I don't know what help I need or what help you're able to give, but this is my cry for whatever help is available to me. So I was very aware at the time, obviously, that this was a cry for help. I mean, I explicitly say that very literally. This was me begging for somebody to help. And I never got a reply.
These are the times we will all remember. Were you there? What did you do? So what do you say? We need to clean this place up?
Thy kingdom come.
Think celestial, making the celestial kingdom your eternal goal.
Listen to me now. Listen to me now.
And he is not permitted to evaluate
innuendo, half-truths, and lies.
Go to some weak-sauce, liberal, Democrat, baby-butchering church, but do not come back to this one ever again until you repent.
Doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken us.
Repent! Repent! Repent!
You are listening to The New Heretics. Shame on you.
JWs are no longer using the term disfellowshipping.
I was about to ask, like, what news I haven't really kept up much. I did see that.
Okay.
That they stopped using the word disfellowshipping.
Which, it's kind of like they're trying to do anything that they can do to make things look better to a court, where they're not actually changing any doctrine, really. Because, I mean, the word disfellowshipping doesn't have some like magic power. They're still shunning people. They've softened the rules around shunning a little bit recently. People can now be greeted at the Kingdom Hall. You still can't really engage in a conversation with a disfellowship person if you're a witness, but you can now like say hello to them if they come in, which is a big leap forward. I'm sure that was shocking and scandalous to a lot of witnesses. I don't know. Actually, I think that these things have probably been more popular than I don't want to be too cynical about it, because I think a lot of witnesses kind of deep down realize that a lot of this stuff is messed up. And so I think when sometimes these real restrictive layers get peeled back, there's actually kind of a sense of relief. Oh, good. We're not doing that crazy thing anymore. I think that was definitely the case with beards. I mean, you see it like overnight, they change the beard policy, and like, we've got I don't know, like every friend of mine, anybody who I still have any kind of contact with, just like even on social media that I see pictures of or whatever, they all have beards.
Yeah.
Now everybody's got one.
So
yeah, I don't know. But apparently, yeah, they're not gonna use the term disfellowshipping as some sort of, or disfellowshipped as like some kind of label, I guess. They're just gonna say that someone was removed from the congregation. So
yeah, I think that the word removed has one, it sounds a bit more politically correct, right? Instead of saying like disfellowshipping, which sounds like something out of the 19th century dictionary or something.
Yeah.
I do think it holds like semantic power, because, for example, this is speculation. I mean, I wouldn't know, but I would assume that if you use disfellowshipping, it implies that the organization has some sort of jurisdiction over those being disfellowshipped, right? So it's like we are formally disassociating ourselves from this individual. If you use the language removed, it both still allows the organization to have the ability to have that sort of like stewardship or like power, but it's not negatively like it doesn't have that same negative stigma, because multiple organizations have the power to remove people from their group. So it's not in quotes, it's not religiously charged. although in practice it will remain the same. It's not religiously charged.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because, like, yeah, if you say the term disfellowshipped to anybody who's even vaguely familiar with the organization, they're going to immediately associate that with witnesses. And if they're not, it's going to immediately sound like a religious term. I think. I think I don't know that terminology gets used anywhere else. And I don't think there's even any other religions that use it. But just this idea of fellowship has become like a religious term. I feel like.
And I think it plays well in tandem with some of the other items in regards to like what's the term? Marking. So like marking is when...
right, which they also got rid of. Mm-hmm. Or I shouldn't say they've gotten rid of it. They've gotten rid of it at the sort of congregational level. It's now up to individual Christians or individual witnesses to determine for themselves who they're going to mark kind of individually.
Yeah, so it's still kind of like you in quotes would have to use like Bible principles and whatever past precedents had been established in regards to like what a healthy spiritual person, whatever that means, looks like. You obviously wouldn't want to associate with them. So I think that plays well with this fellowshipping as well, because, or now the term removed individuals, because if you no longer have a public marking to kind of ostracize someone who has not been disfellowshipped but is engaging in behavior which is not
they want to disfellowship you, but you haven't technically broken what they would consider a serious sin.
Right.
So they used to have this arrangement where they could mark you and they would give a talk from the platform. It's very rare. A lot of witnesses I know probably never even heard one of these. I think it was done a little bit more in the past. It kind of fell out of really common use, I think, at least most of my lifetime. But I've heard a couple of them, and yeah, it's usually it's around the issue of where a witness is dating a non-witness and they're doing it openly without like hiding it. Mm-hmm. And so the organization, that's not the only thing that you could be marked for, but that seemed to be, in my experience, the main thing that would actually prompt them to give a talk at the Kingdom Hall and to actually like formally mark this person. And they wouldn't name them by name, but they would address the situation with enough detail that anybody who was familiar with the person or the situation would know that this person was not to be marked and not to be associated with, really, until they changed their behavior. But it wasn't, it was like a disfellowshipping light or something before they technically had committed what they would deem a serious sin. Yeah.
So I just see that as a natural progression, because then if there's no longer this like public marking, that person is on a path to potentially getting disfellowship now with the updated disfellowshipping guidelines, which have been altered as well.
Yeah, getting removed.
Then someone who essentially is looking to get removed would be someone like an unrepentant wrongdoer, to the extent that it's like, man, you know what, I really don't want to be part of this anymore, yada yada yada. I'm not saying that the best case scenario that would be what happens, right? Somebody that genuinely doesn't want to be a JW anymore is someone who gets removed. I feel like they're setting it up so it's like when they can show in court of law that it's like, oh well, these people naturally would disassociate themselves from us anyway, so why would they want to maintain contact with people who don't engage in these behaviors or these lifestyles?
Yeah, I think they're definitely trying to make it more like it's not them that's like doing the action, it's the person choosing to leave. Like they're choosing to like not follow our rules anymore, which in a lot of cases is not the case. I don't know what the numbers would show here, and I don't know if we have any kind of statistics about this, but like just in my experience anecdotally and having been disfellowshipped twice, I know that in both of my cases, I went in feeling like I was repentant and told them so, and told them that I was trying to, work on the things that I was in there for. And in both cases, they said, like, we disagree, you're unrepentant, and I got disfellowshipped. So this is pretty common that happens, where like a person is saying, like, I want to stay in the organization, like I'm fully in. This is the truth to me. I believe it. I just believe that I'm a sinner. I've messed up. I want help. And in a lot of cases, the elders still will disfellowship somebody in that scenario. There's other criteria they use to determine repentance, and a lot of that's spelled out for them in pretty explicit detail in the book that they use. It goes through a lot of different scenarios for like types of judicial committees and like types of things people might say or whatever, and a lot of elders will use that as sort of a guide to how they decide on repentance or not. It's not really always like a person by person sort of decision.
Yeah, I mean, they have all sorts of, like you said, little guidelines, and if the person did this, do this type thing. And it's not a public book either. Like, a lot of people don't know, one, that book exists, and two, that like what the content of that book is even. A lot of people who were aware of that book, in quotes, it was the secret book, thought that it was like, some like deep knowledge, like esoteric knowledge about like the organization. And they would speculate about it. And it's like, oh, I bet it has like all this knowledge that, like elders need, to be able to be good elders. And that's why they're so spiritual. And it's like, dude, your headcanon is so skewed.
Right. Or like my elder friends would tell me that there was nothing interesting in it, that it was like literally all just like Watchtower article citations, that like anybody could do research on any of this stuff, which is also, now that I've seen the book, now that I'm an evil apostate and I've just looked it up online, not true. There's a lot of stuff in there that is not in a Watchtower article. They might cite a Watchtower article as some sort of justification for something they say in the book, but like these scenarios that I'm describing, I mean, the book is filled with these where it has, this whole long list of, I think there's something like 13 pages worth of serious sins that you can get disfellowship for. And it goes into, quite a lot of detail about something like fornication. Like, what is fornication? There's pages on this. Like, what is fornication? How far is too far? How many times is too many? All sorts of things. And then there's like these like scenarios that it gives where, like let's say somebody comes in and they say that they've done this, and they like walk through like how a sample kind of conversation might go with this person, and the types of things they might say that would indicate that they were repentant or unrepentant, as if people can be, sort of grouped by their types of responses they make, or something to that effect. After last episode's discussion about kind of more of the broad strokes of the questioning process, cognitive dissonance, and the way that humans will develop a sort of headcanon when they really have a core belief that they just can't give up on, they have to hold, as it starts to interfere with the world around them or the things in reality that they experience. They sort of have those humans, we I won't include myself there, we have the option to either give up the belief, alter the belief, or we have to start twisting reality somehow to match what our expectations are based on this core idea that we have. And that can often lead to what we called last time headcanon, which is a term, I don't know where else it's used. I picked it up from being a Star Wars nerd for a while. I've been a Star Wars nerd my whole life, but I spent a year or two actively debating Star Wars on Twitter. That was kind of my introduction to Twitter. And in fandom spaces, headcanon refers to times when in like movie series or storylines where there's lots of installments with lots of different authors and things, there's going to be a lot of like contradictions in the story, typically, especially with things like sci-fi and fantasy. And so fans will create headcanon to fill in those gaps. So like, for example, in The Empire Strikes Back in Star Wars, if you're familiar with this, the Millennium Falcon is lost in space for a while, and they just find a planet that's like close by, and they go, oh, this is like close by. I know the guy that runs this place, Lando, right? And so Han and Leia just fly there. Well, in reality, you can't just fly to a planet in like a week if you don't have hyperdrive working, which is the case in the movie. So people have just invented all sorts of ways that the Millennium Falcon gets there, and that these different explanations for how it gets there, which is never explained in the movie, is referred to as headcanon. It's just something, becomes part of the canon of story, but it only exists in sort of your mind, and it's there to, or maybe in other people's, minds too. There can be like a shared headcanon, but it's these sorts of explanations that you come up with so that you don't get pulled out of the story, or you don't have to like give up on your suspension of disbelief, which really, is jarring. If you're watching like a fantasy movie or something, it'll ruin it for you. So, religious people do this all the time. People in cults do this all the time. It's not even just the people in religions and cults, though. Any kind of like strong foundational belief you have, when it butts up against reality, if you see something that doesn't jive with it, depending on how persistent that is or how big of an issue that is, your brain will just continually create headcanon to make it work. And so what happens is, when you're in a cult, for example, there's a metaphor. I think maybe this comes out of the ex-Mormon community, but I've heard ex-witnesses use this too. But that this idea that there's like a shelf of doubts that people sort of carry around, and this shelf is kind of hanging. It's, if you imagine going through life and you're in your house or whatever, you just have this kind of shelf in your house. It's like that's where you throw all your doubts that you have about your core ideas about life. And what can happen is over time you get so many things on this shelf, there's so many doubts that start weighing it down that the shelf just breaks at some point, and then you're forced to like look at it. And when you actually have to turn and like look at it and see this broken shelf and all of this debris laying all over the ground, it sort of like hits you all at once, like how many doubts and how many problems you had with this belief. And it can really be like it can almost feel like an epiphany, like in a single moment you just sort of suddenly realize like, oh my goodness, I don't believe this. Like, look at all of these problems that I've had with this thing over the years, and I've never really addressed any of them. I just kept putting them up on this shelf where I didn't have to pay attention to it. And then at some point you just are like, now I have to pay attention. And so we want to talk a little bit today about how each of us got to that point and what some of the things were that were on our shelf. Or another analogy might be cracks in a windshield. And eventually you get so many cracks in the windshield you can't see out of the window anymore, and you have to address the problem that's obscuring your view of things. Yeah. So like, do you remember some of your early big like doubts or questions that you had?
Yeah. I mean, there's like a couple like canon or what is that?
Yeah.
Is it canon event? What's the meme? Is it canon event like in Spider-Man?
Canon event? I don't know. It could be a meme I'm not familiar with.
Where it's like something like a tragedy.
Very possible. I'm old.
Like a tragedy happens, like Uncle Ben dies, and it's like a canon event or something like that.
Like a key kind of turning point in the
like
like a fantasy series or something.
Yeah, like a key event or like a plot, like a necessary plot point or something. I can think of a couple that I'm like, yeah, I think that's kind of like, if I had a sandcastle, it's like that's when the, wave after wave it eroded the sandcastle type thing, to put it in a metaphor. So I didn't grow up as a witness my whole life. I think that's something maybe I haven't even brought up, which is that I grew up as a witness primarily from my early childhood up until my early adulthood. So like after my teens, my parents were converts. My mom was raised Catholic. My dad was also raised Catholic. And my grandma was raised Catholic. She converted into the Jehovah's Witnesses after her husband died. She was a single mother of 5 children. And obviously the message of the resurrection really resonated with her. And so over time, she tried to kind of get her children to listen, to study the Watchtower. I mean, obviously by that time, I think they were adults themselves, so it kind of didn't really resonate with many of them. But the one person who it resonated the most with was my mother, who just kind of saw it as like anything else. To her, it was just like, oh, this is just like another Christian group, whatever. And so she just studied, and she just had a familiarity with the witnesses. She didn't get, well, I shouldn't say she never got baptized. She never got baptized right away. She had a lot of friends, and we had a lot of people that we met in my childhood, like early childhood. I was around like maybe 2 years old. And, up until I was like around 4. And that was really the end of it. Basically from when I was 5 up until like 6th or 7th grade, we were not witnesses. Didn't go to meetings, maybe here and there, like once every 3 years, maybe the commemoration, or what is that called? What do you guys call it? The
memorial.
The memorial. We would go to that maybe like once it's once a year, but like maybe once every 2 years or every other year, something like that. But yeah, really inconsistent. I mean, that's why I was like, yeah, my family always celebrated birthdays in like hiddenly.
Oh, really?
We didn't tell people we celebrated birthdays, but we did. We only stopped after we got in quotes serious about being witnesses, which I'll get to that point here. But very like normal-ish childhood. Christmas parties, went to people's houses. I got to trick or treat, I think 2 years in a row or something. So fairly normal.
Yeah, non-witness normal.
Yeah. But there was always like moments where my mom would be like, oh, well, Christmas is pagan. She'd always like tell us like JW believes so.
While she's handing you the present.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like, we're celebrating this stuff and we know it's fake, you guys. Like this is not the truth. And she'd be like, this witness stuff, I think it is the truth. So like, just keep this in the back of your head. And obviously I was like, well, if Santa's not real, because like my grandma would always tell us like, Santa Claus is not real. It's Satan and all this crazy stuff. And I was like, well, if it's bad, like, why are we doing it?
Right.
So you could see like early on, I had like this, I mean, obviously I didn't have a word for it. I was like a really young kid, but it was like this, my family was living in cognitive dissonance, right? Because my mom is an adult. She had experiences growing up that maybe I think she wanted to share with us that she had when she was a child, but then later kind of died out in terms of that family tradition because of my grandma, because of the witnesses kind of being introduced into our family. And then by extension of that, she started to kind of lose some of those things the more she kind of drank the Kool-Aid. My dad was like never like really in it until later on. He was just kind of like, whatever, like you believe what you believe and we'll just go vibe that way. So modern day, or in quotes, modern day, how did we become witnesses, right? How did we solidify that faith? Well, my mom had a friend that she knew through non-witness means. And I guess in conversation once it came up that, oh yeah, like I'm a Jehovah's Witness, her friend. And then my mom was like, oh, well, I used to study with them, blah, blah, blah. And then, she kind of picked up studying again. And I don't recall when it happened. I don't even remember actually when my mom got baptized, but she got baptized sometime, like early on, like probably like sometime in the 90s or something. but she met this friend. She's like, yeah, we're witnesses. And then, that's how she kind of started those connections again. And at the time, this is when I was in 6th grade. At the time, my mom told me, hey, my friend's son, he told me if you wanted to study with him, because he was looking for studies, obviously wanted to look good and have time and all of that. And I was like, study what? Like, what are you talking about? And he's like,
oh yeah, that's like the witness dream, was to have a Bible study like at school, like with some like worldly kid who was like your friend or something like that. Because then you could like justify hanging out with them, and you could also like count time so you didn't have to like go knock on doors as much. Like if you had like an hour of study, maybe you could get out of like an hour of service on Saturday or something.
It's funny because I did that with one of my friends. I was like, hey, if you like just study, we can hang out for like 3 hours, like off the clock. No one's gonna care.
Oh, you just made it explicit, like right up front. I was way more devious about it. Yeah.
No. I told my friend right up front. I was like, hey, do you want to help me out, and like we can like hang out. We wouldn't even study. I'd be like, I just gotta like read a paragraph to you like every now and then. It's just for formalities. Like if your mom comes in, like we just have to pretend we were studying, so that if my mom asked like, hey, did you guys read the book or whatever, it looked like we were, but I was like, no, like this is fake.
Yeah. Smart.
So yeah, like we were studying, or I was studying with this guy. He was a little bit older than me, but I mean, young enough that we could still like relate, but old enough that it wasn't like it was very much still like a teacher student dynamic, right? Like I was probably like 12 and he was probably like 18, 19. So I was studying with him, and then, I was like doing it, and I don't know why. I think because I was studying and I was just kind of like doing it for my parents. The reaction, I remember so explicitly my mom asked me one time, she was like, do you want to keep studying? Like, do you like this? And I was like, oh, I mean, I tried to appease them. I was like, yeah, like it's fine, whatever. And then, so I think because of that, because I remember one time the Mormons came to our house and my mom studied with them, and she asked a bunch of questions, and it was like 3 weeks or maybe more. She kind of went through like the whole study session with the Mormons. And after that, that's when she was kind of like, no, we're going to study with the JWs. It looked like to me like she was inquiring heavily into like different faiths. Because I remember even going to a Pentecostal church, and that was creepy, because people jump up and down with the Holy Spirit. So during that journey of my mom's faith search, or whatever you want to call it, we ended up finally kind of solidifying on the witnesses. My mom started studying, and shortly thereafter, my sister started studying. My dad was the one that took the longest, because he worked so much, he just didn't have time. He probably didn't start studying until I was like in 8th or 9th grade. But it was always weird, because, like I said, we had this pre-witness life leading up to this witness life, and it created this sense of like, well, why wasn't it important back then, and now all of a sudden it's important? And I always felt like my mom did it to kind of like keep us from doing like bad things in school, or with like friends or something, kind of just to create some sort of structure. I think she did miscalculated how much of an impact it would have in our lives. But, I mean, there was, like I said, we still, even when I got baptized, we were still celebrating birthdays. So there wasn't like a super hard rigidity to it all, but more, I could have seen a pattern where over time we would have slowly started to drop some of those things. Because, like, for example, like, my parents, they always wanted me to go to school and blah, 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 like go to college. But like when it actually came down to it, like to actually go to college and stuff, they were like, maybe you should just go to like a local college. Maybe you should just go to like community college or something like that. And they were kind of slowly starting to kind of like, well, I don't know if a like going to a different state or going to a different school or anything like that might be like an option for you, or like, we're just scared that, something bad might happen to you. Ultimately they didn't have a say in that. Like, I still ended up making my own choice in regards to like the school that I went to, but that was like a turbulent time, but
something was getting through. At least that's an indication of why maybe they were drawn to the organization, that it was something that they were looking out for their kids. Maybe it sounds like, or like they wanted you to have, maybe a place that provided some guardrails. Maybe also there was like a social aspect to this too. Cause I'm trying to think about like, why didn't they just like double down on their Catholic faith?
Right.
They could have, right. They could have gone that direction, but there must've been something about a kind of more, I don't know, Protestant, maybe more social.
Yeah, I think a big part of it was because my parents were migrants, so we were not originally from the U.S., and so the fact that she met some friends and it coalesced around similar culture, it just happened that they were witnesses, and she had studied with the witnesses, and so it was kind of one of those things where like we already share one thing in common with these new people that we met in this foreign land. And I think that's what kind of helped crystallize it.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's also something I've noticed too when I used to study with Catholics. I had a long time Bible study with a Catholic family, and there was like this sense that like being Catholic, it was almost like being Jewish for them. It was like just kind of part of their identity, but that didn't like prevent them from like studying with us and like coming to meetings and like just kind of like doing things. If they like liked pieces of what we did, they could like do that. And that didn't seem to be at odds with their like Catholic identity, but they were never able to get over this hump to like commit themselves to becoming Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think in large part, it had a lot to do with just like that they felt like that would be giving up their Catholic identity, not their religion, their like identity. Like things like crosses were really important to them. They had a lot of crosses in their house, and this was just like part of their like aesthetic. The holidays were very important to them and celebrating them and stuff like that. So these weren't necessarily to them like religious really, or they were religious in like a very kind of generic sense of like, it makes like, these are things that make us like feel good or something. But not like grounded in some kind of like theological truth.
Yeah.
And so they were just kind of, I don't know if that's common with Catholics in particular, to have that kind of
I would say most
flexibility.
Most Catholics are cultural Catholics, or just victims of like poor catechesis. So yeah, there's that element. It's just some people are more open to different things, or might be a little bit more loosey-goosey when it comes to their beliefs, because like you said, I think they do see themselves as Catholic as an identity, as opposed to like Catholic in a belief. Like they do believe in God, but it's not like they might not even be fully integrated into the ideas of Catholicism. They might not even know what that would even mean, or what that it would entail. They're probably not regular like mass attenders. So there's like all those aspects. I think that is a super common thing amongst Catholics. And then
So you had this sort of ramp up in your family's spirituality. It sounds like kind of around the time that you were considering going to college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and then were you having questions or any kind of doubts or anything like at that point? I mean, I know you mentioned the doubts maybe about like holidays or like, or why suddenly now are these things like important to us? Haven't we always been Christian? Haven't we always believed in the Bible or something? I can imagine these kinds of thoughts maybe going through your head.
So I remember like when we started getting more serious in like terms of the faith, the truth. Like I said, it was around maybe like when I was like 7th or 8th grade, kind of went around, or maybe like 8th or 9th grade, where my dad started studying with the witnesses. So now it was my whole family was integrated into this worldview. And we started going to every meeting. We started going to the conventions, or what are they called? The conventions or the assemblies, whatever.
In assemblies.
So
those are different to Jehovah's Witnesses for some reason.
Yeah.
For people that aren't familiar with this, there were conventions were bigger, assemblies were smaller, more localized.
And so we started going to those, and then I remember explicitly, because I remember like we were reading the Watchtower and studying the books and doing all this research. And I remember, like I said, there's a couple of canon events. And one of the big ones that I remember was I was really like a nerdy kid. Like, I don't know if you guys can obviously tell, but I was kind of a nerdy kid, and I really liked reading nonfiction.
I was just confessing my Star Wars nerdery, and that was as an adult. So I think if this is a nerd competition, I'm going to win that one.
If there was like a book fair, like at school, my parents would always like buy me a book, because I always asked for one. I was like, I got really good grades, like buy me a book. And I didn't read a lot of fiction as a kid. I was always like a nonfiction. Like that was like my bread and butter. And I remember reading a bunch of stuff. I would read like science books, and I would read like mythology books and history, and just anything nonfiction. I was like, just give me that, I'll devour it. And so I was going through like a really strong science phase around that time, around like 8th grade, maybe 9th grade. And I remember sitting down, we were reading a Watchtower, and we were talking about the Holy Spirit, or something involving the Holy Spirit. And I've tweeted about this, and it was one of the moments where I had it was like a huge cognitive dissonance moment. I was like, what is this? Like, because I was thinking, and at the time I didn't have the words for it or the language. I realized now that it was maybe like, this was kind of like an inkling of like what later would become like my area of interest, like in my studies. But I was thinking about the Holy Spirit and its connection to the human body. And I was thinking, well, Watchtower, these magazines, these study articles are telling us that, God is so powerful and he can interact with us, and he does so through the Holy Spirit, which is like the most powerful force ever conceivable, because, it created the universe, and, it's basically like magic, right? Magic is real. And I was like, well, if this is a force, we should be able to measure it. We should be able to quantize this force. But then I was like, but if it's spiritual, then it's non-tangible. So then we wouldn't be able to quantify this. And so I had this like back and forth. I was like, no, well, we should be able to quantify it because it's an energy or something. And then I was like, well, if it's an energy, then it's limited, or it's finite in some sense. And so I just kept going back and forth. I was like, well, then if it's infinite, then it can't be tangible, because then it's beyond nature. It's supernatural, and so on and so forth. Eventually, it turns out that this was kind of like a debate in philosophy, the body-mind problem, which translates over to like dualism. Not going to go into that, but just for anybody listening, that's kind of where it goes. And I was just like, man, this is weird, because like it doesn't make sense. Why is it that God can create all of this stuff, and yet if he's real, we should be able to measure him. We should be able to measure something about God, or detect God. If the Holy Spirit is energy, if the Holy Spirit interacts with creation, we should be able to observe that or measure it. That's what the science tells us. And some of these questions I would present to my church leaders, that obviously called elders, and they would just kind of brush it off. Like they were like, what is this kid even talking about? I don't know. They would just kind of look at me like a deer looking at headlights, and just being like, what is he going on about? And they would just tell me like, oh, you can like read these publications, but they don't really talk about anything. The publications, for anybody who knows as a witness, they're kind of just like, pray, feel good, God, and make sure that you're studying, because if you don't study, then Satan, kind of like corny stuff like that. And it just never.
Yeah, it is really like milk like it's really like milk. It's really like what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's super milquetoast and like generic, like to the point that like yeah, I mean, like a witness will tell you, like if you were having doubts like that, an elder might say like, well, you just need to keep your spiritual routine, which would just be praying and reading your Bible regularly and going to the meetings and going out in service, and trust in Jehovah is something they might say. But like, what does that mean? Like, I have questions, I have doubts, I have things that are like causing me mental anguish, and you're telling me, well, just basically forget that and just keep doing the stuff we tell you to do, and eventually it'll just sort of go away, right? Like, I mean, more or less what they tell you is put it up on your shelf.
Yeah,
you know, there's not really any attempt with a lot of these kind of big like philosophical questions to ever really address them head on. Like the mind body problem is not something I heard about until college. Like, why? I mean, that could easily be a topic of conversation that you could have in a religious organization, at a religious meeting, that you could give the Bible's answer to these questions. I mean, obviously these are things that Christian theologians discuss all the time. This is one of their big arguments for their theistic beliefs has to do with this seeming contradiction between like the material world and our consciousness, and it seems like there's something different there, right? That seems like it could be a good argument for theism. But like witnesses, and they don't address anything that's deeper than just very surface level, basic like routine, like just keep doing what you do, just keep doing that stuff. Don't worry, the end's coming soon. Doesn't matter. Like, stop thinking so much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's all right. And it always bothered me, because for people who were saying we have the truth, it seems like your guys' worldview can't explain basic things, or like even like really deep or profound things, right? If I'm trying to uncover like the nature of reality, well, it seems like you guys would have written about it, but there was nothing. You couldn't. I mean, like you said, a lot, there's like really intelligent theologians or like religious people who do have these speculative inquiries into some of these subjects, and say what you will about them. Maybe you can say that it's all garbage, but at least they have an attempt. They're willing to kind of stick their neck out and say like, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about this, but based on what we can infer, this is what we can come up with. Watchtower never does that. It never even tries to address that. It just says, well, like, it's not written in the Bible, so therefore it must not be important.
It's not like they're not willing to go out on a limb and like provide some headcanon to fill in like gaps in the scriptures. I mean, they do this all the time with their belief system. For a long time, example, the organization had this belief in types and antitypes. And there was this idea with like all sorts of prophetic, essentially that like all of the kind of major pivot points in the story of the Bible all have some kind of like second or third fulfillment. So like all the stuff that was happening in the Old Testament all sort of has this like second fulfillment in the New Testament, or maybe then even like a third fulfillment, like that relates to like Revelation or Daniel, like prophecy, like understanding prophecy and things like that. And they were willing to like make all kinds of wild connections between the Old and New Testaments that are not explicitly stated in Scripture. Now, in the last few years, they've like rolled some of that back. But there used to be a lot more of that. And I think in the time that we grew up in, there really was this idea that like, I do think that they seem to genuinely want to just stick to what the Scriptures say and try as best as they can to not add to that.
Where it's convenient.
The problem is that's not possible. Yeah, when it's right. It's not possible to not have to not read the Scriptures with interpretation. I mean, that's any text has to be interpreted.
Well, they got rid of the types and antitypes altogether. They formally,
right.
I remember the meeting. That's kind of another canon event, which was when they got rid of the types and antitypes. Because I mean,
Yeah, which
that was a compelling point, right? When it's felt like they were being like rigorous theologians.
Well, and at the time when they got rid of that, I remember I had conversations with people. I was still PIMQ at the time, and we had conversations like, well, wait a second, like so much of our explanation of the book of Revelation, like all these deep prophecies in Revelation that we had like a verse by verse explanation of as witnesses that we would study all the time. Most of that, at least a lot of the major points in there, were based on types and antitype type stuff, type logic, right? That like, oh, well, there's like beasts talked about in Revelation, therefore they must be the same thing as the beasts talked about in Daniel, and Daniel tells us what the beasts in Daniel mean, so therefore we can connect the dots and make that into what they mean in Revelation, right? Like, so there was a ton of this kind of back and forth between like, oh, this symbol in Revelation is clearly a reference to this obscure thing in some verse in the Old Testament or whatever, and that's how we can figure out what it means. But if you get rid of that, which they did in like 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, where they said that no, unless the Bible explicitly says that something from the Old Testament is relevant to the New Testament in some way, or to Christianity in some way, then we can't go out on a limb and say that. That was like essentially almost a repeal of like their entire framework for how they go about interpreting prophecy, particularly in the book of Revelation, which is so foundational to their belief system about the end of the world and the last days and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it got rid of their entire. I wouldn't say it got rid of, but they lopped off an arm essentially to their theology, because I mean, say what you will, I mean, other denominations use typological arguments. It's not like an innovation by any means from the Watchtower and Tract Society, but it was their most compelling point. I think that we both agree on that, which is that it made it feel like, oh yeah, there is like some esoteric knowledge. Like if you look at these inner workings in Daniel, like all of a sudden you have this key to unlock what's being said in the most esoteric book in the Bible, which is Revelation. And we have the correct.
I mean, that's by far the stuff I got off on the most as a witness. Like that was my jam. That was what made me feel like we had the secret knowledge, and that it really was like a secret knowledge. Because like anybody could like read what Jesus had to say and like take some like some notions about like how you should live your life and stuff away from it. But like where I felt like witnesses really distinguished themselves was in this like code that we had like unlocked Revelation.
Yeah, especially with like the numerology stuff, like the end times, like so if you multiply this number by this and 607, and I won't get into that. Maybe we should do a whole episode on numerology and
Bible math.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. But yeah, I mean, like I said, that was another canon event in regards to the type and antitypes, and it was around the same time, and this was kind of what put the nail in the coffin for me. I should say, this is one where I was like, my faith is not really going to recover from this, because the one that really killed it happened when I was in college and university. But the one leading up to it was the one that even propelled me to be like, you know what, maybe I should go to college, was the emergence of JW.org and the emergence of JW Broadcasting. That was a big one. Because I remember the watch, and it was like, it's so funny because I remember each individual step that I was like, now I can look back with 2020 vision and say like, this was clearly what they were prepping people up for, but I never connected the dots obviously until now. A Watchtower article came out regarding the visions of Ezekiel. And they kept talking about Jehovah's cart or Jehovah's car and how fast it goes. And
yeah, his chariot. That's funny. Maybe that was in Spanish. His chariot is how it's usually said in the English translations. But anyway, yeah, the big wheel, like the big it's like a wheel thing, and that's described in Ezekiel with like eyes all over it and stuff. It's
the
kind of an odd image, but
the formal name is the Ophalim. But yeah, the basically the what is it called? Biblically accurate angels.
Yeah.
With the eyes and all that stuff. Yeah. So, we have this chariot.
The four heads.
and we're supposed to follow. It moves faster than light, and we're supposed to follow it anywhere that it goes. And you can tell that they were prepping up, because I think the next article was in regards to the governing body, which was weird, because for anybody that has known the witnesses for a long time, the governing body was kind of in the shadows up until around the time JW Broadcasting kind of started to become a thing.
So much so that I remember that right around the time JW Broadcasting started, it might have been like right after it. It may have been right before. But I remember being in a car group with an elder friend of mine who had just gotten back from elder school, and he was quizzing everybody on the names of the governing body members. Like that was his thing for the week, was like every time he went out in service, he was like quizzing everybody on what the names of the governing body members were. And this is why I remember it, is because almost nobody knew them. Like it was, you might know like 2 of them, and it would probably only be because they gave talks at your convention within the last 5 or 10 years. So you might remember a name or something like that. But yeah, prior to the last decade, these were not like celebrity kind of figures in the organization. Like they were just this sort of group, like you knew the governing body was who set doctrine and stuff, but you really didn't know them or think of them as individuals.
Yeah. I 100% agree with that. But most people didn't start actively trying to memorize the name until, I think it was a Watchtower that came out, where one of the 2-page spreads had like all of the current or active governing body members. And they kind of gaslit everyone. It's like, oh, well, you should know who these people are because they run the organization. And it's like, what? I thought it wasn't about men. I thought it was about God and Jesus and Jehovah. And so when JW Broadcast, or I guess those 2 Watchtower, or however many, maybe it was like more than that, but the 2 Watchtower articles that I remember led up to the special day, because I remember I don't know what it's called. It's like the Kingdom Ministry, which is like the outline for that week for like the midweek meeting. I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, it was Our Kingdom Ministry. It was like a little publication that they put out, and now there's like a meeting workbook.
Yes,
I think it's just called like the workbook or something.
Yeah, it was basically like in quotes like a syllabus that would come out, and it would kind of outline what the midweek meeting was supposed to be about. And they were making a big deal about the fact that it had been 100 years since 1914, and that something big was going to happen or whatever. Well, lo and behold, 2014.
Yeah, and just to clarify, for anybody that doesn't know, witnesses think that the last days that were prophesied in a few places in the Bible began in 1914, and they use some convoluted Bible math to arrive at that date.
We really should do an episode on that, because it's like,
yeah, we should.
It's like it's deep lore, it's canon. And so lo and behold, 2014. JW Broadcasting, I think, comes out. JW Broadcasting, I think, comes out 2014. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they released the JW broadcast, the JW.org app 2013. Or am I getting that wrong?
It's all right in there. And I get the order mixed up too. I think the app was definitely first, and then broadcasting was right in there, and then the new Bible translation was also right in there. So there were like 3 pretty major developments, and then they also changed the meeting formats.
That was
around that time
13
too.
Then, because I remember the Silver Bible or whatever, the New World Translations.
I'm pretty sure that was 2013.
That was 2013. So shortly thereafter.
So broadcasting might have been the year after.
Yeah, like early that year. I think maybe March or February.
Yeah. Or maybe 2015, yeah.
Or it could have been 2015, actually. Whatever. Doesn't matter. These dates all kind of blur.
Right.
And when all of this stuff, this successive change was coming out, obviously, preemptively, they kind of emphasized this metaphor with Jehovah's Chariot in that Watchtower magazine. I was like, yo, what is going on? Basically, we held an Apple event to drop an app, and
it totally felt like an Apple event. You're right.
And people were saying, it's like, look how professional it was, and they were totally like circle jerking around it. I remember people in my hall were like, "Oh, it's so professional," and like this is what utilizing the world to its maximum capacity looks like. Like, dude, you guys are like. I remember actively thinking in my head for the first time in a long time, I was like, "You guys are degenerates."
Yep.
I was like, I don't see how this is anything that I don't see how this is anything better than what the world offers, right? If you guys are going to be out here milking the world for its best fruit, which is technology, internet, apps, all of that. And then basically a production media studio, which is JW Broadcasting. I was like, you guys are just televangelists at this point.
And this was totally an eye opener for me too. And I remember for my wife and I both, she was also PIMQ at the time, to the extent that she was ever PIMQ, but we were both just like, when all this stuff started coming out. It was like the broadcast was kind of interesting. It was like, okay, like, let's see what they do with that. At the time we didn't really know, totally how they would use it or whatever, but that seemed like kind of interesting. But like, I remember in particular the music just being like so cringe to me, like this idea of doing these like sort of pop songs, and it felt so. I grew up in an area where there was like a heavy evangelical megachurch population. It's like one of the most evangelical counties in America, and it just so immediately reminded me of the type of cringe stuff that they would do with these megachurches. And then as the broadcast went along, it started to really feel like televangely. I think in particular where that really hit me, even as a PIMQ again, was Brother Let gave a talk where he basically asked for money, and that was just like something that witnesses just didn't ever do that. There was always this, at least from my perspective, there was always this belief amongst the people that I grew up around that like the organization never even had to ask for money, because like it's God's organization. Like they're never going to need to beg or anything like that. They're always going to have whatever they need. Because it's easy for God to provide for his organization. And so when they actually came out and were like, yeah, we actually need money, like we're dealing with a shortfall here. And it was right after they had just sold like a whole bunch of like real estate, prime real estate in Brooklyn, that they made well over $1 billion. I don't know what the final like grand tally of all the property that they sold in Brooklyn was, but it was in the hundreds of millions, if not multiples of billions of dollars that they made selling this property. And then like a year later, they're going out and begging for money on their new like televangelist broadcast.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
This just felt so like the type of Christendom that we would rail against as witnesses when I was growing up.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that property in Brooklyn was sold to Donald Trump's son-in-law, right?
Yeah, part of it was at least sold to Jared Kushner, or the whatever group represents him or whatever. But I think it was a number of hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate was sold to his group.
Which is wild. The diagnosis is correct. I think a lot of people so I think everybody had a moment of cognitive dissonance, and I think because I remember even people complaining about it, where it's like, oh well, like didn't they just sell this and now we're building a new facility in upstate New York in like the middle of nowhere,
right? Which
is basically people would call it this. They would call it the compound. I don't know if you guys use that term, but I remember that they using the term the compound, because it's like, well, when like Armageddon comes and everyone's destroyed, like they still have to have a self-sufficient place where like they can print out the publications and stuff. And I was like, right. What are you talking about? If the power grid goes out, they're out.
Yep. Or if God is stepping in some miraculous way, he can step in a miraculous way and make it so that they can have power. Whatever, like, all the logic surrounding last days and like great tribulation, Armageddon, like fear porn that witnesses put out, they're still actively putting out now, is so silly. And it's just so illogical the way they're presenting this stuff. Which again, we should we'll do an episode on Bible math and eschatology and end times. witness end times theology, which is just bizarre. But yeah, definitely these were some wake ups for me too.
And then just to kind of like wrap that trajectory up, because you can see how like progressively I started getting in the pattern of like, okay, well maybe I should question this, right? Because I heard like murmurs from older people, and they were like, oh, I don't really agree with this, but whatever. Mm-hmm. And I was young, so I was like, I don't agree with it at all.
Dude, I even knew it. There was an old person in a congregation near me that was rejecting. This person may have been an elder, or it was at least like a long time older brother, but he was like actively rejecting the new Bible. Like he just thought that was like, I don't know, like
adding to word God's word.
There was something like corrupt about the new governing body or something, or that they were like, messing things up somehow.
Yeah, no, I wasn't a big fan of the new translation. I was like, how is this not changing God's word? But whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That gets into a whole sorts of trouble with translations, and so I started questioning. That wasn't enough for me to kind of go like, oh yeah, this is fake. But I was like, this is suspect. At least I can recognize that this is an organization established by men. So that's when I first kind of made the first cut, where I was like, oh no, this is for sure just another religion. Maybe God is real. Or like, no, I was still basically like, no, God is real. And maybe some of these teachings are legit because they're in the Bible. But for sure, the Watchtower organization is like man-made, kind of like where I was. Well, I get shipped off to camp. I get shipped off to college. I don't care who says this. Anybody who goes to higher ed and doesn't at least have a critical attack on their faith, or a complete, restructuring of their faith in college, is not being honest. I mean, you can still be you can still believe in God, but college is one of those things that's going to completely obliterate what you believe. It could be religious beliefs, it could be political beliefs. It's going to really challenge a lot of that stuff, if depending on the college, of course. I mean, if you go to like a conservative or even like a liberal college or something like that, and you get those biases reinforced, and sure, whatever. But depending on this,
I think you're definitely going to confront though your reasons for believing things, no matter what you believe. And for a lot of people, especially like an 18-year-old, that's going to be the first time in your life that you've ever really had to do that.
Mm-hmm. So I was like still going to meetings and stuff. I was kind of skipping some because I was like, I have to go to class. I have to go to an exam. But I was still going to some meetings if I could, or / wanted to. And I remember that my girlfriend, who's now my wife at the time, she was studying with the witnesses. And I was never like, oh, you have to like study because that you need to study so that you can be with me. It was more like, oh, well, like I'm a Jehovah's Witness and like this is what I believe. And so she had a kind of like an interest in that sense. And it was never like I forced her to study.
So you were a better person than me, because I did force my girlfriend, my worldly girlfriend, to study, and she actually got baptized, and it was just a huge disaster.
Oh man,
such a mess.
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to do that, but
you're both better off for it.
It took her telling me, because I remember her the person she did the study with, who was a witness lady, told her, well, so and so, me referring to me, so and so didn't pick Jehovah. So if you want to keep studying, you have to pick Jehovah, basically insinuating that I was bad association. And she told me that she heard that from her. And she told me at that same time, she was like, and it seems like you don't really care about this. So why would I put an effort into something that I don't really care for either, when it's clear that you don't care either? that you don't care about this organization, that you don't really believe any of this. And it took her saying that to me to be like, oh, she's right. I don't believe in any of this. This is all bull crap. I don't care. I'm just hanging on to it for maybe like my friends or like sentimental reasons or like purely arbitrary things that I don't need. And once I had that moment, I knew what I had to do. And it was one of those things where I was like, oh yeah, like like I really don't want to do this because I could lose talking to my family. At that time, they were still very much physically and mentally in. It would mean losing all my friends. They won't be talking to me. And all of those things to some degree happened, except my parents. I told my parents like, hey, I'm not going to be a witness anymore. And I think it took that because I think my parents, and I think I talked about this in a previous episode, where my parents' Achilles heel is like the love for their children. So once they saw me kind of flaking on the organization, they were kind of like, oh, well, I wonder, he must have good reasons to be doing it. And then they started kind of questioning. And then over time, they started to wake up. And then it eventually even led to like my sister, like who's currently physically and mentally out. So like now my whole family technically in some sense they're not witnesses. So let's kind of dive into yours because I know that it would be a nice in quotes juxtaposition to see like how different our experiences even have been.
Yeah, totally. So I talked about this I think early on one of our first episodes, but I am a fifth generation witness. Goes back pretty far in my family to the early 1900s. In the East Coast. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, which is where the organization got its start. So like my family just really has always been pretty tied in to the organization for at least as many generations as I ever knew or had any kind of like immediate like access to. But because of that, it's kind of interesting that like my dad was an elder and always, fairly like prominent in the congregation growing up. And my grandpa was an elder, but my dad always had like a pretty cynical attitude about a lot of things in the organization. And he had a lot of his own, really what I would say are doubts that I still think he carries around to this day, even though he's still a PIMQ, but I think it's possible he's probably in the questioning phase at this point. Is he always had issues with doctrinal stuff. He always had issues with organizational stuff. So there were a lot of like seeds that he planted in my head as a kid. Like I remember talking very early on with my dad specifically about how he never felt like all non-witnesses would die at the end of the world. To any listeners who aren't familiar with JW theology, the reason that they engage in the preaching work that they do is because they think the end of the world is coming soon. Like literally any day. The end of the world could be, or to them is the second coming of Christ, in which he will destroy all of his enemies, who they would define typically as anyone who is not an active and baptized member of Jehovah's Witnesses. So they view it as very literally a life-saving preaching work that they are doing, that it's literally saving people's lives to go out and preach to them and to try to get them into the organization before that comes. And they really do. Like my entire life growing up in the organization, everyone was always under the impression or of the belief that the end could come like literally any day. It's like we are right there at the end of the end of the end. So for my dad to hold this belief that like he just could never get his mind around that everybody would be killed. And you can start seeing why when you start going through the logic of that. But that was always a doubt that I had, and always a question that I carried around with me. And it was things that we would debate sometimes, like when we would go preaching with other people, or like when we would have like, I don't know, like people over to our house for dinner or something like that. We would like get in discussions sometimes about stuff like this. And, it wasn't something that you could say publicly. You couldn't like comment at one of the meetings or like really, or like give a talk and like, put forth these ideas. That would be like totally a no-no, and you'd get yanked into a back room and, you're probably threatened with worse if you do it again. Because those would really be considered like almost the heretical views or like apostasy. But in my experience, almost all Jehovah's Witnesses hold that view. Almost none of them think that everybody is going to be destroyed at Armageddon. And that's because it just goes against, I just think, basic human empathy and like just some kind of decency and like understanding that we have, that there's good reasons that a lot of people aren't going to listen to our message when we, would knock on their doors as random strangers, or people that are just through no fault of their own not going to get the message for some reason. And so it always seemed necessary to carve out some little like exception to the rule there. So that was a big doubt that I carried around through my teenage years, and then that culminated in a dessert that I ended up being privileged to the JW term. They always talk about like responsibilities and any kind of new spiritual thing you get to do as being a privilege. So I had the privilege of having dessert with one of the members of the governing body in like the early 2000s, when I was a late teenager. And somebody that I was with, who I had been discussing this issue with that year. So I'd been out preaching a lot, and this has come up a number of times. And so she, it was my aunt actually, and she prompted me to like ask him about it. So I did. And I just brought it up, and I was like, isn't there a chance that non-witnesses might make it into the new world that the witnesses believe is coming, or into a paradise earth? And the governing body member, he essentially rolled his eyes at me and was really dismissive of the question. His like immediate response was something to the effect of like, I'm always just like so baffled how people think this is possible, or something, something like that. Just something like really like not like dismissive. And especially, this is an old man, who's been around for a long time. He's supposed to be kind of like a loving sort of like grandfather to everyone in the organization. And here's like a young kid who's like, isn't it possible that like God's more loving than we think he is? It seems like it seemed like my heart was at least in the right spot. And so the response should have been, in my opinion, something much more gracious in that kind of a setting. And it wasn't. And that always stuck with me. And then he slammed the door. I mean, he said that if God just decides who he's going to let in and not let in based on like their heart condition, or based on some aspect of their personality or something like that, not the fact that they're a baptized member of the true religion, then there would be no point for our preaching work. And that was a point that stuck with me. And I saw the logic in that point. I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Like, why would we do a preaching work if, like, why would it be necessary for everybody to be a witness if God's just going to sort of choose people and judge them individually or whatever at the end? And so I ran with that for years, and that was like my standard answer. And anytime I would hear other people bring this question up or challenge it in service or whatever, I would always like have this little anecdote that I would fall back on and tell them about the time I had dessert with the governing body member and got it like from the horse's mouth, right? Because remember, they're God's channel; they're speaking for Jesus. But later on, this doubt ended up popping its head back up or falling off the shelf for me when I started just thinking about the fact that, yeah, like, so why are we doing the preaching work? Like, maybe the preaching work isn't necessary, or isn't the sort of life-saving work that they've said it is, because I just can't jive the fact that God's going to destroy 7 billion people. I just can't accept that. And that's where I got to at some point. And so then I had to start reconciling, like, so why are we so focused on this preaching work? Like, what is it about the preaching work that makes it so vital when I'm 100% certain that God is going to make individual choices on people? And then once you start kind of considering that, then it starts to be like, well, yeah, and why are we counting our hours? So like when witnesses go out in service, they count their time, they report their time to the organization. The organization then gives people responsibilities, privileges, titles based on how much time they're putting in for the organization. This all started to me to seem very like multi-level marketing-y or like pyramid scheme-y or something like that.
This is not very spiritual of you, Nick.
Right.
You're not cultivating the humility of the new personality.
I needed to trust Jehovah. I wasn't trusting Jehovah.
You weren't praying enough.
That's right. I need to make the truth my own, make it make sense for me. And honestly, that's what I did for a long time. I mean, I really would just make it make sense to me. Right. So I started trying to work out other possibilities for this doubt. Right. Well, maybe the preaching work's really important because by doing the preaching work, we're showing that we're willing to like do something hard for God, that we're on his side. And maybe in the future that will have a benefit in some way, that humans were willing to do this, even though they didn't like totally have to, or like, even though it didn't have great results usually or something like that. We were at least showing like our willingness to sacrifice for God. There's like different kinds of ways you can start trying to spin this, headcanon it, right? So that was one kind of line of doubts that I had. Okay. So that was a big one that stuck with me forever. And I eventually got around to addressing that and could never come up with a good answer for it. Another line of doubts that ran with me forever, had to do with, just the sort of like organizational structure, the sort of hierarchical, authoritarian, nature of the organization and the sort of tyrannical role that the elders played in the congregations. And I was personally mistreated on a number of occasions. I was disfellowshipped twice, once when I was 19, and again in my early 20s. I think I was like 23 or something like that. And in particular, in the second situation, just the entire way that the situation was handled was extremely cruel. It was very dismissive. When after I told the brothers what I had done, and I was very emotional about what I had done, and was very sad, and like was absolutely feeling like I was repentant and that I wanted to stay in the congregation. The brothers asked me to leave the room for a minute as they were making their decision about whether to disfellowship me or let me stay in the congregation. I could hear them like laughing in the room where they were making the decision, like a minute after I left, and then like it took them about 3 or 4 minutes to decide. And they asked me back in and they told me I was going to be disfellowshipped. So it just like, even like just optically, like the entire process just felt like, I wasn't being treated like a human being in any way. I was a set of sins and a set of, I don't know, criteria that they were like just checking off on a box without really giving me any kind of thought whatsoever. And then this decision to disfellowship me sent me into a tailspin that just about took my life over the next 3 years. I was incredibly depressed. I had a complete mental breakdown. There was a bunch of other things that converged on me at the same time that I was disfellowshipped. But so that whole like incident it always stuck with me. And when I stayed mentally in the entire time that I was disfellowshipped for the most part, but I did go through a little stretch where I was definitely, I never doubted that it was the truth, but I thought that the particular brothers, the elders in the congregation that I dealt with, maybe weren't doing things correctly. And I really felt like I needed to like bring that to light or get some kind of like resolution about that, because I was just like, a train wreck. I couldn't get over every time I would try to go to a meeting, which you have to do to get reinstated back into the congregation. You basically have to clean up your life from any kind of sins that you were committing that led to your getting disfellowshipped. You have to show a period of time of not doing that stuff. But then you really have to become like a kind of perfect witness. You have to be going to all the meetings pretty much. You have to be studying all of the materials that they put out and like show it, right? So it's like not enough to like read it on your own. You need to like have your Watchtower magazine like highlighted when you go to the meeting so that they can see that you like read it ahead of time, right? This kind of thing. So there's like a lot of kind of performative aspects to this where you're really supposed to make it clear to the congregation, the elders who will be deciding this in particular, that you're like making these necessary changes in your life. And because of my like mental state after I got disfellowshipped, all that stuff was like virtually impossible for me. I couldn't pray anymore. Every time I tried to, I would just get like overwhelmed with emotion and thinking about the meeting that I had with these brothers and the stuff they said to me and the way I was treated and things like that. I just because of this kind of mental condition that I was in too, even just like walking into a Kingdom Hall and getting ready, getting a suit on and like cleaned up and then going into this like incredibly embarrassing situation was just like overwhelming to me. It was just like something there were a lot of times early on when I was disfellowshipped that I would go to a Kingdom Hall. I'd spend like a whole day leading up to a Sunday, like the all day Saturday. I'd be anxious about this and stressed out about it and like try to build up the nerve in my mind. And then Sunday morning would come around and I'd get cleaned up and I'd get dressed and like that might not sound like a big deal, but at the time that was like actually even that step was like a big deal for me. I was having a hard time just going grocery shopping and things like that. I was really messed up. And so I would do that a lot of times, and then I would drive to the Kingdom Hall, and then I would just sit in my car and start crying, and I just couldn't get up the nerve to go in, and I knew that I had to go in. I knew that like if I don't go in, I'm not going to get reinstated. I'm not going to get my friends back, my family back. But I just couldn't. Like I was like paralyzed by whatever it was, guilt, shame. This idea that like God had rejected me, even though I felt like I was repentant for what I had done. So at one point I'll read from a letter that I wrote to the circuit overseer. The circuit overseer is kind of like the elder that's over different congregations, bodies of elders. So he's like kind of a top elder in a given area, and he kind of represents the organization. And so at one point I was so desperate for help, and I couldn't get it from anybody. I couldn't talk to my friends. I couldn't talk to my family. I didn't feel like I could pray. So I had no idea where else to turn. And I was getting suicidal. I ended up at one point writing a suicide note to my parents. So I was really like on the edge. And so I tried to turn to the organization for help because I didn't know where else to turn. Right. So I'll read from a little piece of this letter. So I basically laid out to the circuit overseer kind of what I was just talking about, kind of where I was at in life and how difficult things had been for me. And then I said, well, I don't mean to criticize the elders who were on my committee or their decision to disfellowship me. Several things they said hurt me so deeply that I've lost the ability to pray. I know that my relationship with Jehovah isn't based on the actions of other brothers, but I can't seem to wipe off the tears that well up every time I think about how I was treated. Especially disheartening to me is the fact that I prayed to Jehovah while the brothers were discussing my case and asked for him to have them tell me the things that I needed to hear. Then, when I was told after I went back in, for example, that I had been behaving like an animal in heat, that I didn't deserve to be called one of Jehovah's Witnesses because I would continue to smear his name, and that I had been shown undeserved kindness in a previous judicial matter, I began questioning what kind of God I was trying to serve. The overall tone of the meeting, especially the comments of one brother in particular, was contemptuous and unloving. I was already overcome with guilt when I approached them. I was emotionally and spiritually devastated by the end of that meeting. And then toward the end, I I basically begged for help. I said, I'm asking you for help. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life already, but I'm not wicked. I never wanted to leave the truth or stop serving Jehovah. And I never thought that I could be stumbled like this. I try not to blame Jehovah. I try to tell myself that the elders are just men too, that we all make mistakes, that I have to rely on my own faith, but it doesn't work. And I don't know where I can go for help. My parents can't talk to me. They can't study with me or read scriptures to me. My friends obviously can't give me a call to make sure that I'm not suicidal that day or to see if I'm coming to meeting that night. How do I get past this so I can repair my relationship with Jehovah? I know that the system is going down and I don't want to be a part of it, but how do I know that Jehovah views me as the little sheep in his arms? Say, I know you're very busy and that a crazy disfellowship kid probably isn't tops on your list of priorities, but it means a great deal to me that you take time out of your day to read this letter. I don't know what help I need or what help you're able to give, but this is my cry for whatever help is available to me. So I was very aware at the time, obviously, that this was a cry for help. I mean, I explicitly say that very literally. This was me begging for somebody to help. And I never got a reply to this letter.
I was going to say, did they ever write back? But dang.
Not only did they not ever write back to this letter, and no elder ever reached out to me about it, but later on when I applied for reinstatement, this was about a year and a half after this, I want to say, maybe 2 years later. So I'd gone through a lot to work my way back into the organization at that point, just totally on my own. One of the elders in the meeting that I had with them to get reinstated actually made fun of it. He made like a slight, like some sort of a dig at it. He was like, now, if we don't decide in your favor, don't go running off to the circuit overseer or something. He made some like comment like that, just like almost like borderline sociopathic type stuff, I would say. I mean, I don't know what a person can do to like try to get someone else to be a human being more than what I did in this letter and in the meetings that I had with these particular brothers. So that's kind of tough for me to revisit. I'm emotional thinking about these things, but I think it's helpful to get this out there because I know my experience is not unique. I have many friends just in my local area who were treated perhaps even worse than this by some of these same elders and other elders in our area. And I would imagine if we open this up to other witnesses around the country or around the world, there would be a lot of similar types of experiences to this. So I overcame this, and after I got reinstated, I sort of doubled, tripled down on being a witness, and that was the period of my life where I was the most in, probably. I had about a 5-year period where I just like dug my heels in, and I was highly devoted to the preaching work. I was putting in most months between 30 and 50 hours in the preaching work. And at one point I had something like 5 or 6 different Bible studies going with different people in the community that I was like trying to teach witness theology to and bring them, with ultimately always the goal for witnesses is to get somebody to be baptized. You're trying to get them into the organization.
Bring him in into the church.
But yeah, exactly. But I never fully got over some of these experiences that I had with the elders. I also had some experiences, like my family also had some pretty rough run-ins with the elders over the years. My mom had a total freak out at the elders one time at a meeting. She like just went nuclear on an elder in the back room one time, like right during the middle of a meeting because of some disrespect that they showed our family. And my dad had issues even from when he was a kid of some messed up stuff that people did. Now, all of these kinds of things, like these kind of interpersonal issues and stuff, like these kinds of things can crop up in any organization. This isn't unique to Jehovah's Witnesses, but what is unique is the level of control that they have over your life. The way that these guys could cut me off from any kind of help or any kind of like support system that I had is quite unique to a group like Jehovah's Witnesses or to a high control group. There's a little bit question. More. I've got one more big one. Yeah.
Maybe before we segue there, or maybe this might be a good segue to your next point. I don't know. Maybe I'm pre-anticipating what you're going to say, but what would you say was the biggest pillar of faith that you had? Because we all tended to like gravitate towards one, and it seems based on what you've told me that you, at least almost explicitly and in some cases implicitly, always had some sort of doubt in regards to the human component of the organization. So maybe what was the biggest like pillar of faith that you had that made you believe like, yeah, this is the truth?
I think my biggest pillar was our understanding of prophecy. I think I really thought that Jehovah's Witnesses had unlocked like the key to Revelation and Daniel, and that they were the only group on earth who had a full understanding of the last days and different prophecies regarding the last days and how that would culminate in the period of time called the Great Tribulation in Revelation, leading to Armageddon. Witnesses have a pretty detailed explanation for like the series of events that are going to take place during the last days that will lead up to these events. And I always just felt like all of that made like perfect sense. It was like it really was like they had like decoded something that nobody else had. And so for me at the time, that really felt like that was enough for me to give the governing body the credit that they want as God's channel. And that was enough for me to be like, okay, well, they had like, there's no way humans like after, studying the Bible for 1800 years, just some people just happen to like stumble across something new and figure this out. That this must be God's time to reveal it. And he has chosen like this group of people to reveal it to. I really like, I think in particular, I think before I was disfellowshipped, I think I was just culturally a witness. Just that's what everybody did that I was around. That's what all my friends did. It's just who I was. I never really had examined my faith and why I was a witness in any kind of detail. But once I was in college, in my 20s, and I went through the disfellowshipping process, which, as we just saw, like definitely made me kind of reevaluate my beliefs and what I wanted to do moving forward. At that point, I got really serious about studying the Bible, and I think it was just in studying prophecy in particular, and really getting like down in the weeds on feeling like I was really like getting at the meat of like the Bible and witness theology. That's where my foundation was built, I guess I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Because sometimes it's not enough the doubts that we get from like the man-made organization, right? It's maybe some of those other like strong beliefs that really get us or motivate us to maybe like start questioning like, hey, maybe this isn't the truth, or maybe this is like all fake and things like that. It's interesting that you mentioned that cultural witness attitude, maybe.
Yeah.
I think in some cases, it's almost kind of like that metaphor about or that little story about the frog that's in boiling water, right? That doesn't
right.
gradually raise the temperature, and over time the frog will eventually get boiled because it can't tell or can't discern the difference in temperature. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I would say for me, the point where the temperature got too hot and I couldn't take it anymore was probably the other big doubt that I developed over time that kind of led to a bunch of other doubts. And then that's when the whole thing unraveled for me. So I had a good friend So I'm doing well spiritually in the congregation, in the truth. I'm going out in service all the time. I was a respected person in the congregation. I was being used for a lot of different assignments and things in the congregation. I was working toward becoming what's called a ministerial servant, which is sort of like a stepping stone to being an elder. And I had a friend who I grew up with, who I was very close to, and family I was close to, who had a congenital liver disease that he had been battling forever, since he was in his teenage years. And he had gotten incredibly sick and was basically like at the end of his options for trying to do something about his liver condition without a transplant. He was at a point where he just absolutely needed a transplant, and he couldn't get one because of the blood issue. Basically, nobody would work with him on doing a liver transplant unless he was willing to take blood. And he was holding to his faith and refusing to do that. And so he was sort of, I don't know, there was almost kind of like a heroic aspect to that. It seems like people kind of rallied around that. He was like standing up for his faith, and, Jehovah would reward him if he died, and this kind of thing. But then he got really, really sick. He he got put into the hospital. Things got really bad, and he eventually was told that he only had a few days to live, and was put in hospice. And he was moved home, and we all said goodbye to him. We all took our turns going in and like literally saying goodbye and saying, well, we'll see you again in the new world. And we hugged him, and the family all spent a weekend in the hospital just hugging and crying. And this was a family that I was incredibly tight with. I was actually in a lot of ways closer to them than my family. So he goes home, and he just didn't die. Sounds cruel, but that's just what happened. He just didn't. He just kept living, and it was the weirdest thing. Like 2 weeks went by, something like that. I think maybe into a third week. I don't remember exactly how long it was, and everybody was just like, what is going on? And so at some point, his wife went to the elders and or had a conversation with them, and there was kind of like a new sense of urgency to like get him help, that maybe this was like some window of opportunity, that maybe they could, if they really, now that they're at this kind of final hour, this like desperate point, like, could we find somebody in the world somewhere who will like work with him or try to get him help, get him a liver transplant, whatever. So, they all pray about it a lot, and they're working with the organization on trying to find doctors who will work with around the blood issue. And they end up finding a doctor in Chicago, who was a European doctor who was there, and he was like working with the liver team at a really good university hospital in Chicago, I believe. And so he agrees to take on the case. And the catch is they're going to have to move to Chicago, and they didn't have any money. He's been sick. He's been out of work. So we put together this GoFundMe campaign. We end up raising, I think, close to $30,000 from all of our like extended witness, like friends and family and everything. I wrote I put the GoFundMe together and wrote the story about everything that had transpired. And I titled it Fund a Miracle. That was literally how this whole thing kind of felt in the moment. It felt like God had kept him alive, that God had like, he should have been dead, right? The doctors only gave him a few days to live. He didn't die. And then as we put this new like effort forward to try to find him some help, it was like all the pieces were just falling into place. Everything was working out. He found this new doctor. We just had to get him the money. Then we got him the money. They were able to go to Chicago. They spent a couple of months in Chicago working with these new doctors, and he started making progress. And at the time, this was seen universally by everyone around him, everyone in his family, everyone that I knew that had any idea about this story, as God answering everyone's prayers. Everyone was 100% sure that Jehovah had intervened in this situation to save. And and to get him a liver as like almost like a reward for his like all these years of sacrifice that he, had gone through, that all the suffering, and that he had held to his faith. And so God was like rewarding him and the family, right? Now, I remember at this time even having like at moments of rationality, thinking like, yeah, but like, what about the people who have like liver disease, who are witnesses who didn't not die, the people who did die, or, couldn't find a doctor to help them. Like, I'm sure there's other cases like that, right? And I think I even had this conversation with some of the members of the family at one point in service or something. And, they had different headcanon for explaining away why this case might be special or exceptional, right? Maybe he's being used by Jehovah to find a path forward for bloodless surgery for other witnesses, right? So maybe he's kind of the first who's going to get help with this issue, but that's going to like open the door for other witnesses. Or, there's all kinds of like sorts of headcanon that we were creating to try to figure out why he was selected for this special miracle. In the coming years, he was not helped. His situation deteriorated, and he's still alive today, but he is doing horrible. He's basically been living in a kind of purgatory. I like, it's not something I would wish on my worst enemy. The type of like pain and suffering that he has gone through over the last number of years, with this like faint, tiniest bit of hope that he's going to get a liver transplant, that just, it's not happening. And so it's very clear to me now, God had nothing to do with this. Nothing. So it's very difficult when you feel like you're 100% sure that God has intervened in your life, and that he's like opening these doors, and he's like taking care of things, and you see it, and you're like, you're convinced, you see, you know it, you just know that that's what's happened. And then it becomes clear over a course of time that actually, no, like that was just something that you all sort of collectively told yourself to feel better. And when you actually honestly address that, and like none of his family, as far as I'm aware, and that group of people around him really have, I think they're all still PIMQs, or if they have questions or doubts about this, they're keeping it deep down at the moment. But for me, that was when I started finally like coming to grips with that. Then what I started doing is I started testing prayer. I started praying about very specific things in my life. I did a lot of research on prayer, and I tried to enact all of the things that I read from the organization about how you should pray and what you should pray about, and like how you should work along with your prayers. I started asking people in my service groups about prayers that they had answered, because I wanted to hear like, okay, but maybe I'm doing something wrong. I'm not getting any prayers answered. At the time, I was making really modest. I really just wanted some kind of evidence that God was like in some kind of a way, like hearing my prayers, right? So one of the things I was praying about regularly was that we had just moved to a new congregation at the time, and my wife had always struggled with going door to door in the preaching work. She always like hated it. It was really tough for her. She had a really hard time making new friends, but she always did a lot better getting out and doing the preaching work when she had like a social group, like getting her out and stuff like that. So I was praying over and over and over again for Jehovah to please help somebody just to reach out to her, to like make friends with her, like to get her out in the preaching work, just something like I was, and so this was like a prayer that was not selfish, was not selfishly motivated. I was trying to help my wife. It was something in line with his will, as far as I understood it at the time, which is something that witnesses would say your prayers need to be aligned with Jehovah's will. You don't just use them like a genie or something, right? But in this case, I'm praying for him to help her do his will, right? So like this seemed like everything about that prayer should have been an answerable prayer, right? Yeah, kosher, exactly. And that prayer was never answered. She got further and further. She sort of drifted further and further away from the congregation, got less and less interested in service. Nobody ever reached out to her. So that was one example. I mean, there were a lot of other types of prayers that I was saying at the time like that, things where I was trying to test out to see where God was. and if he was in my life. And so that combined with what was happening with my friend, it got to a point, and then the anecdotes that I would hear from people about prayers that they had answered that were like foundational pillars of their faith were just totally like unconvincing to me. It was like really vague stuff, or almost so like hyper specific stuff that it was just so like weirdly coincidental that it was just like, okay, I like that doesn't, it's just like logically I couldn't make sense out of why God would like, oh, your washing machine crapped out and then somebody offered you one a day later, and that's like you think that's God? Like, look, I don't know why. So are you saying that other people who lose their washing machine are going to get washing machines from God? Like, I just all these kinds of things that people give as these examples of like God answering their prayers just all seem to me to be highly contentious.
Yeah, God's going to give
problematic.
God's going to give you a washing machine, but he's not going to save the starving children.
Exactly. Or my friend with liver disease, right? So that was like, I think the big wake up moment for me. After that, I started fading, not on purpose or intentionally. I just kind of lost my motivation to be like, super gung ho for Jehovah when he didn't seem like he really cared to be in my corner at all. And then we ended up moving again to a different city, didn't really know anybody. And then we had then this is around the time COVID hits, and we had a bunch of tragedies in our family. We lost something like 5 or 6 family members over the course of like a year and a half, right kind of overlapping when COVID was going on. They were unrelated, but so all of that stuff, so we had the space from the congregation at that point. We weren't really like socially tied in to a congregation, so we didn't really know anybody. Then we get hit with all these tragedies, and as the tragedies were building up, some of them were with witnesses and some weren't, but the things we were hearing from people and the types of support that we would expect from our religion to give us, or our social network to give us or whatever, just wasn't there. And that was basically it. That's like pretty much after that. Then at some point I started like honestly evaluating. It was around the time I think people were starting to get off Zoom. So during COVID, witnesses were doing a lot of their pretty much all the meetings, and their preaching work was being done like on Zoom, or in some kind of way that was remote. And when they finally decided to go back to meetings, basically my wife and I, at that point, it was kind of like, that's where the rubber meets the road. We had to decide like, are we going to go back or not? And I remember one night we just kind of looked at each other and we're like, I don't think I'm going back. And it was just like, yeah, I don't see a need to. And once we both admitted that to each other, then it was pretty quick after that. Then I immediately, all these different doubts that I'd had accruing over the years, I sort of just started checking them off one by one. I did a little bit of research, and like every time I would do research, it got to the point where like I was like almost like I don't really even need to do research on this anymore, because I already know what all the answers are to these questions, and they're not sufficient to me. So that was my process. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the process was kind of like spread out. Like the deconstruction was like spread out through like a large span of time, but ultimately, like once the opportunity arose to kind of break away from the ritualistic aspect of it, like going to meetings, practicing the door-to-door preaching, once that kind of occurred, I feel like you almost gave yourself the opportunity to kind of like, in a way, do what a lot of people who are like PIMQ, which is like they question, something happens, and they go cold turkey on like some of this stuff. And once you get the opportunity to like kind of go cold turkey and not engage with the organization, it's kind of like a pretty, not always, but it's a pretty like steadfast train to like, I don't believe anymore.
Yeah. I think this is probably true of all cults, just because they require so much of you. They take so much of your time, so much of your mental space. There's a lot of pressure and baggage that goes along with being a member of a high control group. They're literally controlling your life in a lot of profound ways. So you have to be in it. Like you have to be getting something back, for one thing. So you need to be getting back all the social reinforcement and the friendships and the dinner parties and the, I don't know, whatever, like all the like kind of social benefits that go along with it, people bringing you meals when you're sick, you know, there's all these kinds of things that they do to keep people feeling like they're part of the group, and that's really addicting, and it's incredibly hard to break out of. So yeah, I think anybody who's like fully in it like that, they're gonna have a really tough time ever really having the mental flexibility and space to genuinely challenge their beliefs or address their doubts.
Yeah, there would be no need to do that unless there's like primary motivations, like you said, like, hey, that was like a mean thing someone did to me, or like I prayed and something didn't happen, and you know, etc. Like there has to be something which creates like a major inconsistency with one of your main pillars of faith. Like, oh, one of the governing body members started stripping naked and yelling "Hell Satan" or something. You know, like for some people it would take that for them to be like, yeah, this is like...
That's what Tony Morris is doing right now, I think. Yeah, he just like prancing around doing apostasy. I don't know.
Yeah,
in a drunken stupor. I don't know.
What is it called? Is Macallan?
Yeah, at least he did have good taste in scotch. I like Macallan. That's good stuff. But yeah, it's totally... So in my case, I think one thing that comes out of this, I think that might be helpful for other people, is that it can take a long time. It can take a lifetime in some cases. I think we've talked about this a little bit. I think both my parents are in a questioning phase right now. They're in their 60s. They've both been witnesses virtually their entire life. My mom came in when she was a little bit older, but she's been like solidly in it and like a devoted witness for the bulk of her life. And my dad was a 4th generation witness. So yeah, it's really hard when it's your whole world and it's your support group and it's everything you know about the world. And then when you're in a cult, like the witnesses, you know, you're also very much ingrained to believe that they have the one and only truth. That is it. There is nothing else outside of that group. And you're really convinced of that. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't be in the group if, you know, for the most part, if you weren't pretty convinced of that. So when you leave it, or even to give yourself the mental space to question it, you have to already accept the fact that may mean there is no truth, or you're not going to replace that with anything. There's not going to be any meaning to your life if you leave. So not only are you giving up potentially all of your support system, all of your friends, all of your family, but you're also giving up meaning in life. And it's a tough leap to make for a lot of people. And it's been tough on me, to be honest.
Yeah, that's we've kind of mentioned this, but it's kind of that larger aspect, right? That it's kind of a sentiment that a lot of witnesses have brought up, or ex-JWs, or even, well, witnesses, when you kind of confront them with the reality of like, potentially this could be a fake, this is not the truth, where it's like they right away they jump to the existential question, well, if this isn't the truth, then what's the point?
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely tough. And I think that's kind of part of why we also started this podcast, which is to kind of help certain aspects of reconstruction, like maybe show avenues of what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard terrain. I know that for a lot of people, it can lead down a path of like, you know, existential anxiety and depression and things of that nature.
Yeah, it was definitely the first stage I went through. And I remember that one of the first conversations, the main conversation I had with a friend of mine after I decided to leave, that really sticks with me. And that was like, really didn't go well. That was essentially the line of argument he used. At some point he was just like, I don't understand. Like, if you're right, it's horrible. There's not, like, if this isn't the truth, if there's nothing, it's horrible. What a horrible way to live. And it was like, maybe, but I'm not going to keep believing something or keep pretending to do something or be a part of a group that I don't think has the truth. And I don't know what the actual truth is, or if there is a truth out there. And it very well could be that there's not, but like, I think that was almost an admission of the kind of self-delusion that people are putting on themselves, right? It's like, well, I can't imagine something else being true, therefore this has to be true, even though I kind of see your point on a lot of these things. And I think most witnesses, I don't think there's really a whole lot that I would be able to tell a witness at this point that isn't a doubt or something they've already probably had at some point in their life, if they've given any kind of thought to their beliefs and why they're doing what they do. So it's not like any of this stuff is like particularly novel or like a revelation. It's just it sometimes it just takes like certain life events, certain like pillars being attacked, like you said, it's just certain kinds of traumas or like I don't know, kicks in the head or something to just get you to like actually be honest with yourself and reevaluate what you believe in. So when somebody is in this questioning phase, there's kind of stages to like I'm trying to figure out like where did I become a PIMQ? Right? I don't know. I maybe that letter that I read, I feel like I'm kind of questioning there, but I'm not sure I was ever really questioning the organization. I think I was more questioning like the way I think I was really specifically focused on like those brothers and like the way I was treated and like trying to like get some resolution like on a kind of micro level. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe in some ways all cult members are PIMQs. I kind of wonder, like, I think there's probably some people who just never really think about it. They're raised in it. They're just never really going to give any kind of thought to why they believe what they believe. There's a fair amount of people that are just kind of shallow and, or just don't really care to really dive too deep into stuff like that. They just want to live sort of a content life. But I think your average, I think any kind of like reasonably intelligent, reasonably self-aware, spiritually minded person, somebody who thinks philosophically and thinks theologically about the world. I think probably most of those people are at least continually playing whack-a-mole with their doubts.
Yeah, it's a perpetual process of like gaslighting yourself into believing a lie or something. Yeah, and I definitely get that perspective where some people, one, I don't think it's up to everyone. I don't think it's like I don't think that everyone will or that everyone should question every single aspect of their beliefs. I think it's kind of nefarious when an organization like a cult not only it takes advantage of that, because not everyone's going to question all of their beliefs. Not everyone is going to like completely overhaul their worldview or their position. Everyone's entitled to believe what they want, right? But it becomes nefarious or even evil when a group or organization then puts stipulations like even if you did, you have no way out. There's no escape. Like, we're going to ostracize you. We're going to separate you from your family. Like, when they start doing things like that, that's when it becomes problematic. I don't think that it's problematic that not everyone will question their beliefs. It's just that, those ultimatums, like, of not even having the opportunity to even get to that point, I think it's where it's problematic.
Yeah, I agree that the restriction on allowing for people to even have doubts, really. And I think I think the organization recently is trying to do some things to address some of the issues that I've even just raised. Like, they've kind of softened their stance on whether only Jehovah's Witnesses are going to make it through Armageddon. They've kind of softened their stance on disfellowshipping. They're lightening some things kind of around the edges, because clearly I'm not unique here. I think there's a lot of these doubts and issues that I went through are probably, pretty common in the organization. And clearly a lot of the doubts that I had are probably things that guys at Bethel have, to be honest. And so they're trying to come up with some kind of headcanon that keeps them in. But that wasn't possible for me in the end.
Yeah, you look at a lot of other like XJW testimony, like it's like their waking up stories, and it's like, yeah, I think a lot of them converge with some of the stuff that you've brought up, where they couldn't keep up with a headcanon. They've had these questions. They were ostracized in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's important to kind of draw out that, you know, these experiences, although personal, they're not unique in the sense that they pop up time and time again. So the fact that that is even happening within this particular group or organization, or even others, right? This isn't, you look up ex-Mormons, you look up ex-members of Scientology, the way that some of these high control groups keep their members locked up, sociologically and emotionally captive, it has real ramifications. These beliefs aren't just like, oh, well, like, you believe in like Sky Daddy, you must have been like dumb or something. No, like, this has a real concrete effect in people's lives. Clearly, like, you brought up the example that you even had a depressive state where you were considering suicide, and that's a real tangible effect that it has on someone's life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't even have to be disfellowshipped or like officially kicked out of the group to like feel this pressure. I mean, I think you feel it even in, you know, on a day-to-day basis when you're in a group like this. Like, you feel there's this sort of conformity that gets forced on everyone because you're so scared of sort of stepping out of line in a way that's going to make people think that they need to like doubt you, or that you might be, you know, harboring like some sort of like sinister sort of motivations or thoughts or something like that. There's this constant kind of like fear of that. And people who they kind of are on sort of high alert kind of have these like little detectors for apostasy that are like super sensitive, right? And you know that because you have the same detector. And so it's sort of like, it makes everybody kind of conform in this way where, you know, people start talking the same in these kinds of like weird, like drony ways where they sort of lose their sense of identity, and a lot of their personality gets just kind of glossed over, like the edges get sanded off, and you sort of end up in this kind of weird, like mushy, generic middle, at least, you know, publicly. And the more you are like that publicly, the kind of more that's just who you become. I think about there's a Kurt Vonnegut line that I like a lot, that I quote a lot, where he said that you have to be careful what you pretend to be because you are what you pretend to be. Because ultimately, like, we're kind of all just pretending to be. Right? It's kind of like the fake it until you make it thing. But a lot of our identity is just like trying to be something. You know, you if you want to be, like in my case, let's say a writer. Well, you're not a writer unless you write something, right? Like you have to, and you almost have to like put on a persona. Like, what would a writer do? A writer would probably do this thing and that thing. And you start trying to do that stuff, and then one day you find that you are like a writer. You know, and I think there's a lot of overlap there with the way witnesses are. There's sort of like when you first, for like new converts maybe, or when you're young and trying to find your footing, you're like, you kind of look to like elders and you're like, well, that's what a spiritual person looks like. That's kind of how they talk. That's how they act. That's sort of what I need to like mimic. But that person has probably already gone through this process where they've had all of the unique parts of their personality shaved off, you know, and they're down to like just this nub of like mindless cult repetition.
Yeah, it's a cookie factory, you know. They stamp out the cookies with the mold, and you know, it's like, if you rough out the edges, you just gotta make sure, like you said, you gotta sand them off and make sure they're uniform, they conform to the mold, and anything outside of the mold anything outside of this mold is a heresy or you know, an imperfection.
Yep.
I guess quick question, or maybe not so quick, but maybe we can start maybe asking some of these questions. I guess for anybody that's like PIMQ, or somebody, let's just assume that some of those listening, or maybe this podcast was sent to someone that might still be mentally in, but is maybe starting to get some doubts, or does have moments of doubt. What would be your advice to these individuals? Because like, what would you say to what would you say to past Nick, if you could?
Yeah, I would say address your doubts. When you have doubts, there's a reason. There's something's not right. typically. And that doesn't mean that every doubt has equal weight or it is necessarily something that's bad. I mean, I think you can still be a Christian and not be a Jehovah's Witness, for example. Like there's other ways of engaging with Christian faith that wouldn't necessarily cause you the same kinds of doubts and questions that you may be having. So there's no danger in addressing your doubts. I think the danger is really in trying to ignore them. And if you have a doubt that you address, you research it, you're honest about it, you talk to people about it, you get their thoughts on it. I think all of that's like a healthy process. If people in your life are super weird about that, if they're like, if you go to somebody with a doubt and they shame you for it, or they seem like they kind of start distancing themselves from you, I think that should create another doubt in your mind then about that person, about your relationship with them, your friendship with them. And maybe if you're in a cult, or some kind of, maybe, if you don't realize it's a cult yet, maybe you just think it's a sort of religious group or some kind of ideology that you're part of. I think those should be major red flags.
Yeah, that's all. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think even comparing other groups, like maybe you aren't aware yet that your group is a cult, or maybe you're even highly skeptical that it is, but maybe even comparing it to like other things that people call a cult, that you might be like, well, Mormons, a lot of people liken us to Mormons. Maybe I should look into like what ex-Mormons have to say about that particular group. Why are they not the truth? Why, and kind of doing comparative things like that. It's not directly criticizing the organization, and it's not directly doubting your faith if you go see other people's faith, right? We already assume that the Mormons don't have the truth, so maybe go inquire about why it's the case that they don't have the truth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that was something I kind of glossed over at the end of my kind of story. But during that COVID period, Brittany and I watched a lot of cult documentaries. And I don't know why. It wasn't like on purpose necessarily. There's just been a lot of that kind of content that's been coming out the last few years. But I remember, specifically watching like the Leah Remini Scientology series, and repeatedly in that series finding myself going, it's kind of like what we do. Like there was like a number of I remember in particular, there was like a scene of like one of their assemblies, and the crowd size looked kind of very similar to like the size of a witness assembly. And they played a video, like a propaganda video, and the video looked just eerily similar to the kinds of like propaganda you would see at a witness convention. Scientology all over the world, how united they are everywhere, showing all these different like races, like integrated and smiling and united. And just some of the rhetoric was very similar. So yeah, there was just like these moments where you're watching that. And if you maybe you're not even totally like questioning it or, thinking about this stuff, but I think it's hard to not see that and be reminded of your own group if you're a witness, or, maybe similarities in, like the Mormon religion or other things. Multi-level marketing.
Bitcoin.
Definitely a cult.
I think that's all good there. I guess is there any additional advice that you'd give to somebody that's like physically in, mentally questioning, like maybe pragmatic ways to like live in the organization without maybe drawing suspicion, or like tactics that one could take, maybe things that you did during your own even personal experience, like how to go to meetings, but or like how to address doubts, what kind of resources are out there, if you know of any, or how to keep a low profile, or I don't know, anything that you have maybe.
Something I just thought of is that there's this cliche that you don't really know something until you have to teach it to someone else. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I've done teaching in my life, and I will say that you gain mastery over a topic in a different way when you actually have to teach it to someone else, because you really have to have all the holes kind of covered, because some, who, depending on who you're talking to, right, they're going to have questions and things that maybe you haven't thought of before if you do it long enough. I think for me, one of the ways that I really started like questioning things, or something that got me thinking about a lot of this stuff on a regular basis, where I sort of had to start facing these doubts, was doing Bible studies with people. So there was a stretch, like when I was talking about going out in service all the time and having all like this, what I say, 5 or 6 Bible studies at one time, I was also going on Bible studies with other people. So I was going on like a ton of personal Bible studies for a several year period. And when you do that, you get lots of questions from the people you're studying the Bible with. I mean, you really have to like start mastering what you're teaching them. And it also starts to help you realize like some of the holes in the theology. I mean, like a simple one would be like, so you're studying with somebody and they have a beard, and you get to the point where you're like, well, you need to shave your beard. There's not a scripture that says they need to shave their beard, right? Like why? And up to that point, when you're studying with somebody, you've been telling them the whole time that, well, one of the big things about Jehovah's Witnesses is that we only follow the Bible. That's all, like everything we do is like straight from the Bible. And that's what the problem other religions have, is they don't follow the Bible. And then you come up to something like that, and you're giving people counsel and trying to get them to change something about their life that you do not have a scriptural principle for, or a Bible verse to point to. So those kinds of things, like this comes up all the time in Bible studies. And so I remember getting in a lot of conversations, like after we leave a Bible study, or sometimes things would even come up in the Bible study where like it would just get a little awkward. And I would find myself saying things sometimes like, well, there's not, this is kind of a gray area. We don't really have a great reason for this, or something like that. It's just kind of the way things have always been done. And, the more you're saying that kind of stuff to somebody else, it starts to build in your own mind, I think. So yeah, ironically, I would say maybe the process I went through of like doubling down on it and trying to be like uber spiritual, it might have been key in my waking up.
Yeah, I think that's apt, because like you said, you don't really know what you believe until you gotta teach it to someone else. And I think that's kind of why maybe some things have streamlined in the organization, and in regards to like Bible studies. You don't see as much as an emphasis in the door-to-door work. It's more like you come to these like metropolitan areas where it's like cart witnessing is like predominantly now like the one of the primary public ways of doing the preaching work. And it's all referrals to videos, and you don't really get to talk, because it's like, well, I don't have an opinion about my beliefs. It's whatever this week's video is, right? It's like, whatever the organization says, it could be one thing today and one thing tomorrow. And so they really are trying to kind of break away from individual people doing their own research and having like even canned responses. It's more just going like, this is what we believe, in quotes. And then it's like, but I really urge you to go check it out on our website. That's kind of what they're really pushing towards. And so
yeah, and they've even started saying things lately like, if somebody is really like wanting to kind of argue with you or debate you on like certain kinds of Bible topics or whatever, to basically just like leave it, like just drop them, because like they're not interested or something. It's like back in the day, that even in my lifetime, and I know it was more like this like in the 50s and 60s, but even in my lifetime, like in the 90s, I always felt like I had to be really up on like our arguments against the Trinity, for example, and like, certain kinds of like biblical doctrines, because we would try to like debate people like at their doors and stuff. I mean, we would try to like argue them into being more open-minded about some of these issues. And that seems to be totally gone now. The organization is not interested in giving their members the kinds of education that they need to even be able to have those debates, to the extent that they ever did do that. And they just don't even seem to be interested in it. It's kind of like they're just looking for people who are just like desperate for something, and they're sighing and groaning over the system of things, I think is a term they use a lot. And if somebody's not in that state, well, first of all, they're probably not likely to come in. So I think they've probably just figured out you're typically going to like argue a Calvinist into like a Bible study with a witness or something like that. So at some level, it's probably practical on their part to do that, but at another level, it's really watering things down, I think, for the average witness.
Yeah, it almost seems just to be like a way to, it's like make them do busy work to make them think like, yeah, the organization is still growing, but it's really just all the material or the content is just, it's mostly for the benefit of the ones who are already in. It's like, yeah, this seems like the truth, and this reaffirms it, and this is all I have access to, and this is what I need to read and what I need to watch. And all of that keeps you busy. It doesn't let you really have too much doubt, especially if the people who you're talking to, one, either don't care, so they'll shut the door on you, or just be like, I'm not interested. And two, if they do seem like the debate bro type, where they want to shut down your argument for why the Trinity doesn't exist or it's not in the Bible, they'll probably just be, like you said, combative, or you'll see it with an air of combativeness, and they'll probably just move along and be like, yeah, well, maybe at a later time, maybe Jehovah will reach their heart at a later time.
Right, yeah. Maybe if their life gets bad enough, they'll actually be desperate enough to listen to us in the future.
Right.